On this episode of China Unscripted, we talk with China corporate consultant Pierce Norton about the Chinese Communist Party's predatory economic practices and the trade war event horizon. Hi, welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And just want to remind everyone to leave us a 5-star rating and a nice review, or a bad review if you don't like us, but I can't imagine that ever happening.
On iTunes.
On iTunes. Thank you, Shelley.
Yeah, listen to us on iTunes. Although you can also listen on our website, ChinaUnscripted.com. We're on Stitcher, Spotify, and we have a YouTube channel. That's just sound with no video.
But with great thumbnails, guys.
Great thumbnails. Oh, the last one I loved.
If you haven't seen the thumbnail for our last podcast, please go on YouTube and
Being
check it out.
podcast number 19.
Yes.
It's about Kim Jong. Happy birthday, Kim Jong Un, or something like that.
That's it.
It was a beautiful thumbnail. Took many hours in Photoshop.
And copious amounts of eye bleach.
Oh yeah,
That's true. Brain bleach is a prop we used on the show once.
Oh yes, that's true.
all right. You drank a bottle of brain bleach. That was good.
Brain bleach. Say that 3 times fast.
Brain bleach, brain. I thought I could do it. I was so confident.
I was confident you'd fail. That's what makes our team strong.
My failure?
That we never expect the most out of each other, so we're not disappointed.
I thought it was going to be undermining.
Yeah, that too.
I'm excited about this podcast. Event Horizon, Trade War Event. That sounds awesome.
Definitely does.
You do know what an Event Horizon is, right, Chris?
Yeah, I saw Interstellar.
What is an Event Horizon?
It's where you think you found your new home planet, but it turns out Matt Damon is evil.
I feel like you were trying to undermine Chris, and then he kind of just turned it back around on you.
That's typically what happens when I try to undermine Chris.
Verbal kung fu.
I think actually what we need is a new podcast, Science Unexplained.
You will know less by the time you're done.
I definitely know less about what an event horizon is now.
Excellent. Matt, what's an event horizon?
Well, I could explain it, Chris, but I don't think that's necessary.
But it's useful for understanding what we're talking about with the trade war, right? Because if we're approaching a trade war horizon...
So if a trade war is a black hole, and the event horizon is the point at which no light can escape from the black hole, what does that metaphor mean?
Oh man, it sounded so cool, but is it meaningless?
Yeah, well, no,
it's a point of no return.
It's a point of no
return.
Yes, you can't escape the black hole.
Did you see that old movie where they create? Oh, it was called Event Horizon. It was about the spaceship. They created a spaceship that could fold space, but it turns out that it folded space into hell or something.
Is it the one with that big sphere?
No, I think that's called Sphere.
No, okay.
My favorite was Cube, actually.
Time Cube.
That's my favorite explanation of life and everything.
Event Horizon, an old movie. It's from 1997.
Yeah, old movie.
Lawrence Fishburne and Sam Neill.
Yeah. Well, at any rate, so we're gonna be
in any event horizon.
All right.
Let's I know. Thank you. That is truly the black hole we will never escape from. Thank you, Shelley.
Yeah, and unfortunately for our guest, he now has to join us to talk about the trade war.
He does. But before we do that, is there anything else we want to do, Shelley?
I don't know. I feel like today might be special for somebody.
A special day?
A special day. Maybe.
Is this about me?
Is it your birthday today, Chris?
No.
Ooh, it's my birthday.
It's Matt's birthday. Well, at least the day we recorded the podcast, it was Matt's birthday.
Yes. Whatever day you're listening to this, it will not be Matt's birthday. Unless you're listening to it 365 days from when we recorded it. Or would it need to be 364?
365, because it's not
that would take
a leap
you back.
year.
Okay.
But so why are you bringing this up?
We might have something for you.
Ooh, is it wrapped?
Oh,
I'll be right back.
Just
Talk
you
amongst
wait.
yourself.
well, Matt, it's just you and me temporarily while Shelly gets something.
Oh man, such a relief not to be one-upped all the time, isn't it?
Wait, does that mean I don't one-up you?
Actually, you just did one-up me. Oh, she's back. You weren't gone very long.
Ooh, you're not seeing this now, but like this wrapping is nice. It's like covered in the Twitter logo.
It's gold. It's golden and red wrapping paper with
Well,
little red robins on it.
You know, sometimes in life, what happens is you only have Christmas wrapping paper.
Ah, well that makes sense. Also, what's weird
Those
is
are also
that
cardinals. Continue.
honestly, red cardinal.
Well, that's redundant because all cardinals are red. But anyway, continue.
Unless they're Catholic.
What?
I think they also wear red.
That's true. They do wear red. So
Happy birthday!
So back to being one up. So it is my birthday, and now I'm holding this wrapped present, which you can't see because it's a podcast.
Stop trying to describe it and just open the present.
Make sure you get that right near the microphone.
Ooh, Three Kingdoms Redux.
I believe the X is silence. Redo.
Redo. So,
I like how you managed to convince him of that.
Three Kingdoms Redux is a board game that seeks to recreate the tripartite. Oh, the tripartite? Tripartite? Is that a word?
Tripartite. Yes.
Tripartite? That seeks to recreate the tripartite between the states of Wei, Wu, and Shu. You assume the role of one of the three lords, Cao Cao leading Cao Wei, Sun Jian leading Eastern Wu, or Liu Bei leading Shu Han. Well, I know I'm going to go with Cao Cao because one of my favorite expressions in Chinese, you know how we say in English, speak of the devil, which is short for like speak of the devil and he shall appear, right? Well, in Chinese, they actually say shuo Cao 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 Dao, which is like speak of Cao Cao and he will appear. So it's kind of like
And it's less like,
it's less like the devil because Cao Cao wasn't a devil. He was just a warlord, I guess you could say.
He's usually portrayed as the bad guy, kind of.
But history is complex.
No, it's not.
You're right.
Anyway, it's basically a
Yeah, what is this thing you
civilization
gave me?
game, but about the Three Kingdoms. And they thought it was perfect because there are three of us.
Mm-hmm.
So we could actually play this on the show. This is
I don't think you
Board
want to.
games,
I
unscripted.
don't think you want to play this
if
on
you
the
want
show.
to be bored. No, we're not going to play this, but it is a board game. Three Kingdoms Redux
Does look fun.
looks fun, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to play this right now because we have something else to do.
But by the way, when we do play it, I fully expect to get my butt kicked because I am bad at strategy games.
Yeah. Also, between the three of us, Chris is the only one who's read the entire Three Kingdoms.
Yeah, that's why. Also, I feel like a bad Chinese person because I've never read The Romance of the Three Kingdoms.
Well, Chris,
So
you're
good.
you're a good Chinese person.
Thank you, Matt.
But anyway, thank you very much for the gift, and yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't. That's it. That's all I got.
All right.
All right.
Am I supposed to give you something? Like, what are you waiting for?
Are you a hobbit? Please give us presents.
I am not a hobbit.
It's almost 11sies anyway. All
Let's
right.
let's not make this a hobbit.
And we're back to the black hole.
All right.
Is the black hole puns? Is that what's happening?
No, it's all light. It's sucked up.
By
No
Matt's
light
puns.
escapes.
Because I feel that's kind of true.
It is. It's a very apt metaphor. Hey. So, joining us now is Pierce Norton, a corporate consultant. Pierce, why don't you say hello and introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Pierce Norton. I recently returned to America after living in China for the past 4 years as a corporate trainer. I also graduated from Tsinghua University. As a corporate trainer, I worked with large, very diverse parts of the Chinese economy. So I worked with state-owned enterprises, private institutions that I'm sure a lot of your audience would recognize, like Volkswagen Financial Services and DuPont. So I worked with multinational, state-owned enterprises, small private institutions. So I think when it comes to discussing Chinese trade practices, I have a pretty good understanding of what it looks like sort of on the ground, if you will. And I'm just excited to talk about that today.
Great. Yeah, you've been there, you've seen it. And I appreciate you being a bit modest about it, but just for people who don't know, Tsinghua is like one of the biggest, most prestigious universities in China. So congratulations.
Well, thank you. It was a good test of my Chinese skills.
I bet. They don't speak much English there, do they?
They do. A lot of the students.
Now I look like an idiot. Oh, God, I'm leaving.
Don't
Trying
worry.
to start off on the right foot. Yeah, but the people there are they're so smart, and they test for English at a pretty early level. So a lot of their English levels were quite high.
Wow, cool. All right, well, let's get down to it. So we're currently in the middle of a 90-day window where China and the U.S. have a chance to come to some kind of trade deal. If no agreement is reached, then tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods will go into effect. First, Pierce, in an ideal world, what would a meaningful trade deal between the U.S. and China look like?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
A meaningful trade deal would certainly have to address a lot of things. So first and foremost, a lot of attention has been paid to hacking of United States companies, and of course that would have to stop. But then there's also a lot of other things to talk about, like there's privatization or loosening of government control of the economy. And I think most important to today in talking about that, there are sort of these large things that we constantly hear in the news, like hacking and state control. But what's really important, I think, is that China would have to commit to some sort of long-term dispute resolution mechanisms that define free and fair trade. So like this is really worth expanding on. So there's no definition of free and fair trade. So the WTO, the IMF, businesses ranging from multinationals to state-owned enterprises, these people and institutions, there's no commandments of free trade. What makes free trade free and fair is dispute resolution that's largely conducted in good faith. And I think that's been missing for a long time with trade between China and America. So there's little things like, so I'm sorry to keep going, but there's little things like, not little things, but there's things like hacking and privatization, but there's going to have to be some sort of dispute resolution that's enhanced.
So dispute resolution, doesn't the WTO have a mechanism for that?
Yes, but it's largely failed the United States. So I don't know if you remember, but President Obama once in his one of his debates with Mitt Romney famously said that he's brought in more cases against China to the WTO than any other president. And that's true, but his wording was very careful because the United States largely lost those cases. And so I think it's interesting that we often look with the current trade war dispute as a Trump thing. I think the United States has had grievances for a long time, certainly since 2003. I think that's a meaningful year. But maybe I can give an example. So a good example would be Chinese hacking in the United States. So President Obama and Chairman Xi signed an agreement not to hack each other's private companies for commercial gain in 2015. And by 2016, early 2016, Wired magazine was writing articles claiming that Obama had ended Chinese hacking.
Uh-huh.
And the Trump administration signed the exact same document and formally agreed to it in 2017 in October. And the reason this keeps coming up is interesting, because the White House's National Cyber Strategy, which is published most recently in 2018, explicitly talked about trillions of dollars being stolen in intellectual property that's continuing to happen. So there's a lot that falls under WTO framework. A lot of it we can get to specifics if you'd like, but a lot of it has failed during the Obama administration, and a lot of it doesn't even fall under WTO law, like intellectual property theft. And these are issues that we've even had formal agreements between the United States and China that aren't being honored.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you saying Chairman Xi. That's an important distinction to make. A lot of people still just call him President. So I appreciate that. Also, with the specifically in regards to the 2015 agreement between Obama and Xi, didn't the Chinese Communist Party just find other ways to get a hold of U.S. intellectual property, like by creating new cybersecurity laws, for example, in China that required companies to hand over information as part of an agreement of joining a joint enterprise with a Chinese company.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the case. And then also in 2016, that was the really big M&A year. So as a corporate trainer, I worked really heavily in mergers and acquisitions with state-owned enterprises, with ChemChina and with CRRC, which is Zhongguo Zhongche. They're the largest producer of rolling stock in the world. They're currently producing new subway cars for Boston and Chicago, I think. So CRRC is huge. And so if you look at outbound investment into foreign companies, Western companies, 2016, the sort of lull year, was also the year that instead of just hacking companies, they just bought them. And so it's really impossible to say what the correlation is and if it's so explicit, but it's really a great convenience. And so drawing that, that's sort of my own suspicion. But there's a lot of things that happened in 2016, and then in 2017, 2018, you see a complete fall off in M&A, and you see a complete pickup in cyber theft.
Yeah, and wasn't there a report recently about those Chinese subway cars being made for the U.S., possibly being able to spy on its occupants or being programmed with some kind of malware that would just make the car crash if somebody wanted it to?
Is Huawei supplying the
it's beyond just Huawei.
Yeah, that was something in the Washington Post that was about possible. It's not the ones that are currently being built by Boston,
but concerns
or
for
Chicago,
the metro line.
But yeah, concerns about the Washington Metro in particular, since there's a lot of government employees that will take that metro.
And I have to say that if China did build the Washington D.C. metro and programmed it to crash, it would only be slightly worse than New York's subway line. Sorry, there was a lot behind that statement.
Yeah, there's like a lot of
Yeah.
anger and frustration.
Yesterday was terrible on the subway. It was just, but I mean, it's always terrible. New York has the worst subways in the country, if not.
No, I
Some of the
think
worst in the world.
no, we do not have the worst subways in the country or the
LA?
world, because I used to live in Philadelphia,
Oh,
Ooh.
brotherly love.
and that was barely a subway system. So yeah, New York's not great when compared to like the Tube or Hong Kong or like many other places, but it's definitely not the worst in the U.S. So we can be proud of that.
We're not the worst. Okay, so back to the trade war. So you say a ideal trade deal between the U.S. and China would involve things about dealing with intellectual property theft, hacking, and some kind of way to properly resolve disputes. How likely do you think it is that we will get a deal like that?
Impossible. Maybe that's too strong, but I certainly think that's the case. So if you consider the spectrum of possible trade deals and you define a significant trade deal, considering the possibility of China making significant economic concessions to the United States, as well as the barriers to a significant economic change, I am optimistic that a trade deal will be reached, but I'm beyond pessimistic that a significant trade deal will be reached.
Okay, so why?
Like, what are the elements of what would be the ideal trade deal, and then like why are those, in your view, not possible?
The ideal I guess I'm going to go from America's perspective.
Right, because that's the one that's important.
Obviously, it would be number one.
All right.
Sure. So maybe I can first talk about how I see Made in China 2025, and I think maybe we can provide some context to that, and we can sort of go from there, because a lot of what America has spoken about has really been focused on it, but I think the context around that plan is pretty important.
Yeah, it's really critical.
So first, Made in China 2025 is increasing Chinese domestic content of what they would call like core materials or 21st century businesses. We might call this emergent tech. Core materials, in its current definition, is supposed to be like 70% produced in China by 2025. That's the gist of what they're saying, that emergent technology is the market share of the Chinese market share is supposed to be incredibly high. And when people hear 70%, sort of a lot of Western lawmakers now are panicking. And I think there's good reason for that. And it wasn't that long ago that the same thing happened to the solar panel industry.
Hmm.
So
Yes.
yeah, so I think that's important. So Made in China 2025 is important, but it's not unique. It's just the latest of state-backed planning. And so just because it's worth repeating that the problem between the relationship between America and China is not, it's not just one thing. It's not just hacking. It's the inability to influence what is essentially state planning. So if I can go back to solar panels, the Chinese market share for solar panels and solar cells in 2003 was 1.6%, and by 2011 it was 60%.
Wow, that's a huge jump.
Yeah, so this is in the same way that China very quickly became to dominate the solar panel industry, killing American solar panel industry, by the way. That's what it plans to do with Made in China 2025. And what you're seeing is not something unique from China. You're just seeing a new response from America.
But with the solar panels, did China dominate that industry because Chinese solar panels were just that much better?
Yeah. That's what China would say, certainly. But they don't make they're not profitable. That's I guess what's important, because the companies that are state sponsored, they don't have to make money.
They're just backed by the state.
Yeah, they're backed by the state, and so that's worth exploring the way that. So when I think of a meaningful trade deal and the barriers to change, what we're really talking about changing China 2025 or changing what happened in the early 2000s, a decade ago, is stopping or limiting or creating at least a working framework where we can discuss what it means to have fair or not state-backed planning.
Well, the thing about state planning is I don't see any way that the U.S. could influence the Chinese government to stop doing that. Do you?
Yeah, absolutely not. That's why I'm so pessimistic, because especially if you consider the size, it's very interesting to me that when we talk about Chinese economic reform, very seldom do I hear about the size of the state sector. It is very large. So maybe we can go through what I guess meaningful change to me is something that's long-term and viable, not just now, but it's repeatable in the future. So I think for that to happen, you have to see a lot of things change. So all state-owned enterprises are held under the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission of the State Council. That's a long mouthful, right? So that's also the SASAC. This is the largest economic entity in the world, absolutely. And as of 2017, its companies have combined assets of $26 trillion. They have revenue of $3.6 trillion. This is not, when it comes to state-owned enterprises, especially state-owned enterprise reform, they have become so large, and now they're held in what is a hold. It's not even just a holding company. The SASAC is an active manager in all state-owned enterprises, and it's integrated through finance through Central Huijin. Central Huijin is the supervisor of all financial institutions in China. They own the big four banks. They have a majority share of 9 out of 10 of the second-tier banks. So in China, all the banks are controlled by the government, and state-owned enterprises have trillions of dollars worth of revenue. And if all of these organizations are like the SASCC, these are all staffed by the Communist Party. So the Communist Party chooses. These you could go to Bank of China in New York and you could open an account. Well, maybe you guys couldn't. I don't know if you guys can, but you could go and you could just think it's a normal bank, but that bank is staffed by the Communist Party, and the oversight given to it is also run by the Communist Party. So what that means is through other institutions like the National Development and Reform Commission, these institutions will set input prices. They will give financial benefit. They will give preferential loans to communist-backed companies or emergent technology, and they will also have the backing of trillions of dollars worth of state-owned enterprises and on all of their assets. So there's like this great, none of these individual things are unique, but the way they're vertically integrated together to produce an outcome, like creating solar panels, like maybe the company doesn't have to pay back its loan. It's okay, right? Because it's all state-owned. So I guess what I'm saying is that taking these things individually and then even looking at their sum, I can imagine none of this changing because the United States is unhappy. It seems ridiculous. I'm not sure what the United States really wants long term or is expecting long term, because none of these things are up for discussion. I don't think that if there's a new Cold War, in 2019 between China and America, and instead of being fought, being military spending, and it's about capturing new technology, I don't think that the Communist Party is going to say, well, they're unhappy that we're doing our Communist Party thing, so let's just end ourselves. I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, it sounds like communism is very profitable.
Well, I love the part about being able to take out a loan that you don't have to pay back. I mean, like, how do I get one of those?
Be a Communist Party official in China?
Yeah. Actually, it's pretty simple. You're just in the wrong place.
Well, I think what's interesting about what you've said is that you're painting a picture of this entire like state planning system. But I think for a lot of people, the idea that this still exists is even a surprise. Because I think, it may be known that like resource companies in China are largely state owned. Like, so if you're talking about oil or steel or shipping, but you're saying also new technology is increasingly like state backed, right?
Yeah, and it's impossible. It's so even if you take out what's explicitly state owned or even invested in, you still have the party, which is so overreaching. So when I was in Volkswagen, I was this was the first time I really saw it. But Volkswagen frankly it's a great company. It's very well organized, and they have like all the young mothers will have like, on the weekend, they'll have like a meeting and they'll bring all of their kids, and like Volkswagen will pay for little classes and entertainment. It's really nice. And so they'll have boards that will discuss, upcoming meetings and events. And I was sort of surprised when I saw that there's a Volkswagen Financial Services Communist Party organization. And I was just sort of, I found it interesting. It was one of my first accounts. And what I later found out to be true, and I was surprised that it doesn't get more press, is if there's 3 party members in a work unit or a company, they are required to form a party committee for that company. So, for example, multinational. So even the party is so overreaching, it doesn't have to be even explicit when it comes to ownership or influence. You could have a private Western company, but they're going to more than likely, there's 80 million, maybe more than that, party members. And if you have 3 in your company, you're going to have a committee, a Communist Party committee.
So that just forms in your company whether you like it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So if you're a Western business and you're going to operate in China, you need to know that more than if you have a certain number of people, you're almost certainly going to have a party committee in your company.
Wow, Volkswagen really is the people's wagon.
I don't mean to talk poorly. I hope it doesn't sound poorly about.
No, because that's just that's a requirement of operating in China. And
that's just the way it is. Absolutely.
It's not just Western companies. Not just companies, schools, hospitals, they all have to have party secretaries. So there really is no distinction between the Communist Party and really anything in Chinese society today.
Yeah, so the requirements and state control, it extends beyond SOEs. It's private companies, foreign firms. It's everyone.
And let's not forget that a lot of the major quote-unquote private companies in China are also run by high-ranking Communist Party members.
Or relatives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Or like Huawei, right, is a good example of this, where Ren Zhengfei, who's the CEO, is actually I'm not sure explicitly whether he's a party member, but he's a party member, and he's a former high-ranking military official. So, to say that Huawei is a private company is to sweep under the rug all the very real things that are happening in terms of the influence of the Communist Party on that company.
Well, you would be foolish if you were running a business to not seek out the support of the government, especially if you weren't a state-owned company, but you beat out sort of the state-owned companies to become the national champion. So like if you were Huawei or a telecom company in general, you would be foolish to try and be private because
Or
then
like
it's just not
Alibaba.
going to. Sure.
So, Pierce, you worked with multinationals in China. Did you get the sense that they understood the environment that they were coming into?
It depends a lot on the company. So, so for example, DuPont, I'll talk about DuPont. So I worked with DuPont Pioneer. So it's specifically Pioneer. So Pioneer was the agricultural side of DuPont. They sell seeds, like GMO seeds. And so the seeds are very expensive and, compared to their cheaper counterpart and their yields are better. But agriculture is a protected industry, and Pioneer made no money. And I hope this doesn't sound negative because the people were all brilliant, frankly. But it was interesting talking to the Chinese staff because at the end of the day, they were sort of grim about prospects of growth, and they were right to be because Pioneer eventually, with the merger of DuPont and Dow Chemical, with Dow, they opened up a whole new seed business, and it's just protected. So it's interesting that it seems like on the larger scale, DuPont or Pioneer was trying to make it work, like they were trying to push into offering seeds to farmers, to local to farmers, but it was doomed. And if you looked on the ground and you looked at your Chinese staff and you asked them what's the possibility of this business growing, they would smile politely and say none.
That seems to be like a very common story. Western companies, sometimes with the best of intentions, going into the Chinese market and just not really being prepared for the fact that they're up against a state apparatus.
I think the payoff is so large that it's worth trying, but you get the sense on the ground that it's complete. I mean, I understand that maybe the numbers are too enticing to pass up, but at the end of the day, on the ground, it's sort of a depressing atmosphere in that I'm going to sort of milk this train for as long as I can, and then once I can find something else where I could maybe a more lucrative position that's available to be long term, because eventually they knew the company couldn't sustain itself because it was losing money.
And now you see the situation where a lot of these companies are moving to other Southeast Asian countries, and it's actually having kind of a negative impact on the Chinese economy.
Yeah, is that a car?
No, there's no way we're in our living room, and there's no way that was a car outside. That's ridiculous. It was Shelley. She makes weird sounds. Please don't call out. She's very sensitive about it.
Continue.
Yeah. There's certainly a lot of pressure, and I think a lot of the pressure is on the smaller companies or private institutions. I feel these companies they really, they don't have the relationship with the bank to not make money. They have to make money.
Do you mean smaller companies in China or smaller countries from the West going into China?
So I think the large companies in the West, okay, this is pretty large, and this is pretty broad, so it's almost unfair to say, but if they are making less money or the prospect of losing money it's almost worth the risk if they can sort of quote unquote make it. But I think who really feels the burn, especially now, is definitely small and medium-sized enterprises in China. I think there's a lot of evidence for that.
I have read that there is some worry in certain sectors because it seems from what the certain pronouncements from the government lately make it seem like they're actually moving towards more state control over enterprises or more state-owned enterprises than before.
Yeah, it's very interesting that if you just if you look up how many state-owned enterprises there are, I think China makes a lot of noise about the fact that in the past few years, it's the number of national state-owned enterprises, what they would call central SOEs, is I think 98. or is it? I think it's 102. It's around 100, almost exactly. And they'll make sort of a lot of noise that it's down from 150 in 2008, from over 150 in 2008. So the total number of central SOEs, of national level SOEs, is has gone down. But that's not because these companies are just gone. They've just merged together. So they've just created larger institutions that are just greater monopolies. I think that's the
It's like
that's the
it's like a nightmare version of like 1980s corporate culture.
yeah. So for example, when I worked a lot with CRC, with the rolling stock manufacturer, and that was a merger of the two rolling stock companies in China. So there was CNR and CSR, and they merged, and so that was in 2015. So then they could check one off the list, like, oh look, we got rid of a state-owned enterprise, but there was no change in state holding. You know, there's no.
It's just fewer, more powerful state-owned enterprises.
Yeah, you're just creating greater monopolies. That's all you're doing.
Greater
So-
monopolies.
Yeah, a positive outlook. A positive outlook.
So it's for this reason. Well, this is one of the big reasons that you think a trade deal is just not going to happen.
Yeah, so I think in general that there's so much money and power concentrated through the party into a specific type of what they would call socialism. So,
Socialism with Chinese characteristics.
yeah, well, yeah, certainly what they would call socialism with Chinese characteristics. And so what that means on the ground and what that means in reality in China is that there's a state holding company that connects these really large monopolies, and that those monopolies can get preferential access to finance, and that if you want to invest in China, or investment in general needs to be approved by the National Development Reform Commission. So you have all these ways that the Communist Party is integrating these monopolies together to find what they would consider the most important synergies. And so for right now, that's not solar panels. It's moved on to be AI. And so when you think of, if America's outlook is, I want to stop made in China 2025 from happening, I have bad news for you. And the bad news is that there's trillions of dollars in assets that's been specifically designed to be integrated to produce plans like Made in China 2025. And the key point is that it's been working. I mean, it worked in solar.
The real concern is that the Communist Party wants to control AI.
Yeah, so there's a humanitarian aspect to it. There's a fear of what it's going to mean if a company, or if a country that's building war islands in the South China Sea is in charge of potentially world-changing technology, that bad things are going to happen. And I think that's fair to say. And then to say that the Chinese Communist Party is going to give up what it sees as the way to achieve its goals, they've worked for years to structure it this way.
So you told me we're approaching a trade war event horizon. What does that mean?
Oh, sure. So there's certainly a lot of noise very recently about a breakthrough, right? So Vice Premier Liu He will come to Washington, I think in this month, at the end of January, the 30th and 31st.
Yep.
Yeah, and he's in charge. He's in charge of the Chinese trade negotiations. And so then also on Thursday, this past Thursday, the 17th of January, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that was very positive, stating that the U.S. was considering walking back tariffs to advance trade talks.
Is that the one that was saying Mnuchin was trying to push that?
Yeah, he's definitely been sort of the pro. He's sort of known as like the pro walking back of tariffs side of the White House. And then on the other side, you have Robert Lighthizer and the trade representative. So I think the key point is that I don't think China wants. I think they would love if I think both parties would love a political win, and the deadline before the tariffs come back is March 1st. And there's really been a lot of news creeping out, especially in the past week, about trade agreement, right? Especially with because there was a point in I think October of 2018 when the Chinese were canceling trade negotiations and sort of being very unhappy. And it seems like things are warming up, and that Chinese delegations are being scheduled to come to America. So what I mean by event horizon is it looks like there's a possible deal being made, but it's impossible to know right now what that deal is going to be. I mean, is it going to be significant? Is it just going to be that the Chinese buy a large sum of oil? It's
Or
that part is hard.
Just more U.S. products.
Yeah, but then it's like, what could they be buying? America just posted its largest trade deficit with China, and ever, I think. And I mean, the idea that America would be willing to make a deal with a communist country for with a state planned solution is very interesting. I think that's very telling. So, I mean, I would find it very interesting that the United States wouldn't stick to its guns about free competition in the open markets and would take sort of a Band-Aid that could then be renegotiated. You're sort of creating a whole new negotiation tool and point of leverage for America if they're sort of not behaving. So I find it interesting that that's even on the table. I've heard that being talked a lot about in the media, and I find it sort of fascinating that America's solution would be state-backed in general, state-planned in general.
Well, I mean, one of the things that has been a concern is that the Trump administration wants U.S. farmers to be able to sell more products like soybeans and sorghum and corn to China. And, of course, while that would help the farmers, of course, at least in the short term, it's basically saying if China were to agree to buy an increased number of, say, U.S. agricultural products, you're essentially relying on China's state-backed model to be making these purchases, which aren't a normal thing in a free market anyway.
Yeah, and I feel like
that bankrupts it.
Yeah, and I feel like that's such a betrayal of the issues that we've had over the past 15 years anyway, we being the United States. But I feel like that's such a, if your issue with China is its state-backed plans, I don't think your negotiation should be, well, in the short term, a short-term fix would be, give us a cut and give it to these farmers. I don't think that's what the United States just should stand for.
And then just kind of, I mean, certain things would be better, like maybe the stock market would go up, right, in the short term.
Well, if the stock market goes up, then everyone wins.
Well, I feel like a lot of financial reporting or a lot of kind of thinking around that is based on very short-term things like how are the stock markets doing, which is a lot based on how people feel.
Feelings are important.
Yeah.
I just think that context is so important, like the idea that Made in China 2025 is not, or our current trade deficit is not a short-term problem to be fixed, and that the problem is state planning and our lack of ability to address their state planning. I shouldn't say there. I mean, that's too divisive. But America's inability to have good faith negotiations with state planning, that's the issue, and it's the issue that's been happening for 15 years. And I think selling out on that is a little sad.
So what happens if the United States sticks to its guns, which I hope it will, but obviously China's state-owned enterprises, that whole system won't be able or be willing to reform. Where does it go? An immovable object meets an unstoppable force. What happens?
Well, yes. I think that's the million-dollar question, and I think what's important to know is that when it comes to influencing China, that America has a pretty poor track record. So when you consider privatization in China and overcoming large structural barriers to change, it has nothing to do with the United States and has everything to do with Chinese economic failure. So maybe to be more specific, I'm specifically talking about the 1990s. So in the 1990s, specifically in 1997, there was the beginning of China's super large wave of privatization. And so the number of SOEs vastly went down. We just saw a complete change. We just saw a complete change in how China operates. And a lot of this has to do with how profitable they were. So if I could give some examples, financial losses in industrial SOEs. So we can just stick in the industrial sector. So this isn't all SOEs, but financial losses of industrial SOEs being able to rise in the late 1980s, and it's pretty telling. So as a measure by the portion of losses after tax profits, in 1989 for industrial SOEs, that's 24.3%, so that's not bad. In 1990, it's 89%. And then you see a rise as the 1990s get later. So as a percentage share of SOEs post-tax profits, SOEs losses were 96% in 1995, 192% in 1996, and 204% in 1997. So what prompted China
so what do those percentages represent?
Sure. So this is after-tax profits. So if you take, I think the tax rate at that time was 55% for SOEs. That might not be right.
That's a good, healthy communist level of taxation.
I'm mainly amazed how you can keep these numbers in your head. How is that possible?
Well, it doesn't matter. I went to Tsinghua.
Mic drop.
I went to California Lutheran University.
Uh-huh.
That's it. I'm leaving.
Yeah.
Let's see. So I guess that is worth saying that it's interesting that you even tax an SOE because it's all state owned. I've always thought that was interesting. Because it's all for the state anyway, right?
It's like I'll give money to myself.
SOE profits are just held by the state, and then the taxes are held by the state. So it's all. I've always thought that was sort of silly sounding, but. So if you consider after-tax profits, right? So let's say that after paying my taxes on my income, I have $10.
I'm sorry.
SOE losses. Thank you. It's a hard time here in North Carolina right now. So SOE losses in 1995, it's 96%. So that would mean I would make 40 cents. I would keep 40 cents.
Wow.
And then in 1996, it was 192%. Losses are 192%. So that means I would be down money a lot.
Yeah.
I'd be down. I'd owe $9. Yeah, I wouldn't have any profit. And then in 1997, 204%.
So the government basically jettisoned a lot of these state-owned enterprises. Yeah,
there's a lot of other ways to think about it. Also, there's I'll get to that in a minute, but yeah, there was an explosion. So I'm not going to make a prediction about the Chinese economy. People do that all the time. But in 1997, the debt-to-equity ratio, for again, this is just for industrial SOEs, is the debt-to-equity ratio in 1997 is 1.87%, and that is compared with 0.75. That's 1.87 as compared to 0.75. So you have way more debt than assets.
Mm-hmm.
How are you doing this with the numbers?
Well, I'm getting them kind of I'm sort of stumbling here, actually.
I can't even remember my own age.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Well, we won't bring that up. But there was an explosion of debt, and there's a lot of ways to think about it. So there's an explosion of debt. SOEs are not profitable and bleeding money. And at this time also, a lot of foreign companies are buying into China and buying these assets. And so China had to reform because it wasn't it was very clear that what they had wasn't sustainable. And so there's a lot of talk in China today about, SOEs and state-owned companies, and if you're going to dominate the world's production of solar panels, that means you have to operate at a loss. But you can't operate at a loss forever. I mean, like if debt's piling up and you're going to do that forever, then eventually something's going to change. So,
right. Well, the key is, though, that when they, in the late 90s, when they started disbanding these SOEs, the Communist Party wasn't actually willing to fully give up state control. They just realized that running their own companies was inefficient. So they let them privatize. But through the SASAC and other mechanisms, they were still using Communist Party mechanisms embedded within these privatized companies to control things sort of behind the scenes and at least make sure they were towing the line, or make sure that the right types of companies got the low interest bank loans, some of which didn't need to be paid back, and so on.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, there was a huge uproar. It was politically extremely, very, very difficult there was great opposition to privatization for the sake of privatization. That was not what happened in China. It was, we're going to sell off our dead assets or we're going to be bankrupt. I think it's much more self-preservation than changing because of some moral compass. And then you're certainly right that that happened like immediately afterwards. So you had great reform from 1997 to 2002. And then in 2003 is when immediately after the change in leadership, that's the Hu government, the Hu Jintao government. You saw the creation.
Said that would have been a perfect lead into a Who's on First joke.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I should have left it at Hu.
Yeah.
I'd also completely forgotten about Hu Jintao.
Who?
Yeah, but anyway, 2003. That's immediately afterwards. That's the creation of the SASAC, the Central Huijin. That's the creation of the State Planning Commission, changed into the National Development and Reform Commission. So 2003 is really the beginning of a whole different set of economic planning that is sort of predatory and state-backed in nature. So there are great barriers to change, but China's done it before, but it was only sort of like at death's door.
So you said the word predatory. What does that mean in this context?
Sure. So I always think of it as I've always thought of it as the what's known as the public body debate. So public bodies, that's that's WTO jargon. That just means that it's not explicitly the state, but it's state-backed. So WTO rules, they prohibit certain forms of subsidies. And so what they do is they measure receiving subsidies. And it's not always obvious that the government is giving subsidies or subsidies being provided by the government or associated entities. So, for example, it's entirely possible for you as a government to create like a holding company or something, or a shell in general, and move money from one to the other. And so maybe your shell company isn't explicitly part of the government, but it acts like the government. So the WTO would consider that a public body. And so WTO rules extend to subsidies provided by a public body. And so when I mean predatory practices, I mean providing subsidies so that Chinese companies or state-owned companies or whatever you have in China are operating at loss. But because their subsidies are so high through public bodies, they can operate at loss. They look like they post profits. And so there's a lot of ways that this happens, right? So this could be low interest rates on loans. And this in particular with finance, it's interesting that this has been going on for so long. So it's certainly, if GE Capital offers a preferential loan to GE Aviation, that's seen as okay because it's not state organized. It's not a public body. But how do you know, at what point can you say that the Bank of China giving preferential loans to another state-owned enterprise is a public body? And so that's the mechanism. It's not always just through finance. It could be through anything. It could be through cheap land. It could be through quicker access to creating buildings or making investments in general. All of these things, I think, are what I would certainly call as predatory. So there's hacking. Hacking is causing certainly billions and what the United States claims is trillions of dollars worth of loss. But there's also this practice where Chinese companies don't have to make money, and it's sort of interesting because it's at Chinese people's expense. Like that money has to come from somewhere, and that money is transferred from Chinese households to Chinese state-owned enterprises. It's always interesting how that happens.
That's a good point. That again, the victims are the Chinese people.
Yeah, it's but what's interesting, when you're in China, the people are pretty proud about it. I mean, there's certainly a sense of community about it. And then like if you ever go to China, one of the first things you notice, well, one of the first things I noticed besides the smog and cameras everywhere, was the propaganda on construction sites. So every construction site, at least around Beijing and Shandong and South China that I visited, is like walled in, right? There's a wall, and on that wall is sort of propaganda about togetherness and the country doing well. And I think people eat it up. I mean, not everyone does, but I would say the majority of people I talked to and met were sort of proud that their national champions were doing well.
Well, to be fair, dissent is not something actively encouraged in Chinese society.
Yeah, well, yeah, I certainly agree. I certainly agree.
So here's a question for you. So we're talking about things that are affecting China, Chinese companies, the Chinese economy, countries or companies from other countries who go into China. Is there also an effect on, like, say, the countries that China is going out to, like with the Belt and Road and a lot of things that we're seeing, state-owned companies coming out and doing these construction projects in like all these different countries? Like, does the state-owned nature of that have an effect on the economies of these other countries?
Well, usually specifically recently with the Belt and Road and large infrastructure projects in general. So state-owned companies are the ones that are winning these contracts, and so these state-owned companies have they've invested so much in themselves that they have what anyone would call excess capacity, and that excess capacity needs to be used in some manner. And so using it in any manner is better than not using it at all. And so what you see is a lot of investment in using of these infrastructure industries into building of foreign countries. So like foreign countries largely being like in Africa and Pakistan and Southeast Asia. And I think Western countries, specifically America, Canada, and Europe, are not really using these, but I think I have a feeling that maybe I've never been to Africa, but I have a feeling that those people probably rather have a loan of any kind than rather not have it. I don't think it bothers them if it's done by a private enterprise or not. I don't think that matters to them. I think most people on the ground don't really care who builds their roads. I think the role for most people, what most people care about, is an idea of fairness, and the idea that if you think something is not fair, you can address it in good faith. I keep coming back to this because I think this is important. I mean, I really find it to be like the key point here, that when it comes to using state-owned enterprises to build bridges. I mean, as long as the bridge isn't falling down, which I know happens, but as long as the bridge isn't falling down, I think most people don't care. It's just the role of government here would be to make sure that it's built fairly, and that that infant industry or native industry has a chance to compete, and that world industry has a chance to compete, and that negotiation and chance to compete is done in good faith.
But fundamentally, the Chinese Communist Party does not allow for this fairness.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe that's what they would call like a American construct, and maybe it's not actually fair. That's something you would hear. Yeah, absolutely.
I think they would call it win-win cooperation.
Yeah, I think that's what they would call it. Yes, if you're winning, it's really easy to say that.
So at the end of the day, do you think the trade war was a good way to deal with this?
Oh, that's a really good one.
Thank you.
I don't think it's good. No, I don't think it's good. But I think what America is seeing and what's happening is I think it's important in that it's the end of. I don't want to say capitulation, because that sounds almost too soft, because it's not like America wasn't trying to influence China before. But I don't think it was done in a good way. I don't think tariffs helped. You saw when the tariffs were in effect, we saw a steady increase in America's bilateral deficit, and bilateral deficits aren't so telling in nature. But it's not like we were getting great results, and that there's no evidence that the tariffs were really making America great again. However, I do give it marks for trying to do something. I mean, for at least creating an issue, being vocal about hacking, being vocal about unfair investment practices. That's a key part of the 301 investigation. And I think I give the administration effort for doing something. Yeah, I think it could be a lot better, but doing something is better than doing nothing.
Well, so then what do you think might have been a better alternative, or moving forward, what do you think would be a better course of action to take?
I would target financial institutions and not. I would target Chinese finance and capital flows and not goods. So I think in the 20th century, this is sort of trade theory, and this is not really relevant to my experience, but it's certainly true that in the 20th century and 19th century, trade was the culmination of small movement of goods. But capital account flows, the movement of finance in the 21st century is capital account flows as opposed to trade flows are so important. And so I think America is one of America's better tools to fight back would be our financial leverage. And I wish that America would sanction Chinese banks that had North Korean accounts. I think that China shouldn't be so free in their buying of U.S. treasuries, and I think that you can make it financially much harder to do business with those companies that are unfair. I think that would be a better idea than a 10% tariff or 25% tariff.
Do you think that the increased tariff is going to happen in March? Just given the difficulty in coming up with a fair deal?
I think there's going to be a Band-Aid deal. But I'm sort of going out on a limb here because there's no way of knowing. But I have a suspicion there's going to be a Band-Aid deal and agreements for future talks, and a lot of positive rhetoric from both sides. But that's complete speculation. But I think there'll be a Band-Aid deal, maybe a commitment to buy some goods in the near future, and I think that's all that's going to happen.
Well, Pierce, thank you for the incredibly insightful interview. If somebody listening wanted to learn more about you or what you do, where should they go?
Sure. So if you, I keep a blog where I write about China and sort of what I find interesting about the world. That's pcnorton.com, pcnorton.com. I just got back to China. I haven't got on the Twitter bandwagon, so that's a pretty old bandwagon. I don't know if I can say that, but
from China.
Yeah. So anyway, I update my blog semi-regularly, and you could find my writing there.
And I do recommend the blog. Check it out. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelly Jung.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
And be sure to subscribe on iTunes, 5-star rating, and positive reviews.
Yes. Leave those for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.